Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Once More with Feeling. Again, I'm Nalise, and I figured that today we would talk a little bit about session zeros, what they are, and why you need them, and then also a little bit of advice on how to run a good one. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so step one, what is a session zero? Well, a session zero is basically a session that you will do before the actual start of your game, hence why it's numbered zero. Session zeros can be anything from designing characters together to talking about sort of rules of the game to doing a couple of practice rolls if you're new to a system. A big thing about session zeros that I like to do is I like to talk about the emotional stuff behind it. This can be anything from topics that are off limits to topics people want to engage with. And that's sort of the thing that I'm going to go into more today. What kinds of questions are going to be useful to be asked during session zeros, and then what, as a DM, should you be looking for so that you can learn from a session zero to run a great game? So, the first thing I like to talk about in a session zero is administration stuff. So, this is going to be when are your sessions taking place? Where are your sessions taking place? How often are you going to have sessions? Are you every week, every other week, or something else? Uh, this is sort of the part where even if you've discussed it beforehand, I like to go over it again in the table setting so that everyone really knows what's going on. This is also a place where you can talk about, what system are you guys playing? Make sure that everyone knows sort of the rules that you're working with there. And also, when are you going to skip sessions? You don't need to necessarily have a big set out schedule of like, oh, on the third week of this month, we're not going to play. No, I mean more if players are absent, are you going to miss that session? I've played in games where I would not have a session if even one person was absent. And I've had games where I would still have a session if only one person was present. They give different sort of vibes to a game. There's benefits and trade offs to both of them. I find that if you play with only, like, even if only one person is present, the majority of the party might lose the plot occasionally. But I've also found that if you don't have a session, if one person is absent, that you end up not playing a lot of that D&D and doing either one shots or group games or just filler stuff. Neither is wrong, neither is right. A good rule of thumb I like to use is if half the party is there, then I would still have a session. I find that that's a really nice middle ground of, okay, most people know what's going on, but we're also not going to be missing every other week because something has come up. These are things that, again, don't have to be answers you have brought to the table as a DM. These are things you can talk about with your players because that is the point of the session zero. By and large, it is communication between yourself, your players, and your players to make sure that everyone is on the same page and everyone has a bit of an input on how this game is going to be run. Other things that are really important for session zeros and for the mechanics of session zeros are things like, is food allowed at your table? Is alcohol allowed at your table? If you do have food or alcohol, is that something that the host will be providing, or is that something that the guests need to bring? It's all up to you guys and your table and how you want to play it. I found that usually the host not providing snacks is really helpful, just because the host is already providing the space. But again, this is fully up to you guys. You might have a host that really wants to provide snacks, and that's great. Make sure that this is allowed at the table, that everyone's okay with it, and see where your game goes from there. What I mean here is things like, okay, you've got a system. What system are you using? What rule books from that system are allowed? If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, are you strictly player's handbook only, or is like Xanthar's guide allowed? Are homebrew things okay? Can your players pick any homebrew, or do they need to, make sure that you give it the okay first? I would highly recommend you making sure that what your players pick is okay, because there are some very powerful homebrews. Um, but then it also gets into the stuff like Acquisitions Incorporated or the Matt Mercer stuff. That has been published by Wizards of the Coast, but it's not core rulebooks. Are those things okay? Basically, chat with your players, see what they want, see what they don't want. If you're a DM that doesn't like homebrew, there is no reason you need to include it in your game. Just make sure your players know that it's not allowed. That can save a little bit of heartache and headache later on the line. Other things I like to talk about during a session 0 include things like leveling systems. Are you going to use XP? Are you going to use milestone? Or are you going to use something else specific to the system? For example, in my Call of Cthulhu games, the Call of Cthulhu rules as written are you only level up after an investigation is complete. Personally, in the game that I'm running right now, I like to level up after every single session because it is meant to be more of a sprint Call of Cthulhu than a marathon Call of Cthulhu. Just make sure that this is communicated to your players. Everyone knows what sort of leveling up is going to look like, or if leveling up is even possible. Some games might not have that as a mechanic, and make sure your players know that then. I find that it helps a lot to set these things down early so that while you might get questions about it later, most people will already know, okay, this might be allowed, this is probably not allowed, and can build their player character into that system that you were going to be running. Other questions that I really like to ask during this session 0 include things like, hey, is this a game that you guys are playing to win, or is this a game that you guys are playing to enjoy? If it is winning, okay, what does winning look like to you guys? Is winning beating the final boss, or is winning writing a very nice collaborative story? This is something that can immediately sort of figure out if you won't need to be more antagonistic, throw very hard challenges at them, or if it might be a bit better if you fudge the numbers a little bit. A monster can have plus or minus 10 HP just to make sure that the final blow is really cool. Again, nothing is wrong. And I need to remind you guys here, the DM is a person at the table too. Your word counts just as much as your players' words count. If it's not something that you're going to enjoy DMing, it's fully all right in a session 0 to say, hey guys, thanks for this. I don't think this is going to work out. And just not have a game. I would much rather people find groups that they really mesh with, that match their interests and match their likes, than trying to force a game where not every player is going to be fully on board. Other really important questions are things like, what is the player character's role? Are they meant to be these really powerful heroes, or are they meant to be just people who have stumbled into the wrong situation? Things like this, and then also questions such as, as a GM, what do you think my role is? Is it the evil overlord pulling the strings, or is it the person making sure that what they want to do is feasible within the rule system? None of the answers are wrong. The answers just change a little bit how that specific table is going to end up playing a game. That's the biggest thing I want to stress here. No answer in a session 0 is wrong. The only thing it is information. It is information with which you can build a better game that hopefully is going to be a lot of fun for both yourself and your players. The last little bit I like to chat with before getting into the more emotional side of gameplay is things like, if you're gone, what is your character going to do? So I've had games where characters just sort of like magically poof out of existence and don't exist in a day. Or I've had games where it's assumed that the character is still with the party, they're just not really doing anything. This is something that you can chat with, that you can make sure that everyone's on the same page about, because if somebody does end up missing a session, it's nice to know ahead of time what their character is doing. So I think that leads us through most of the administrative tasks. And I think that leads us through most of the sort of less emotional game tasks. So let's now get into the meat of this video, which is, how are you going to set up that session 0, and what are some really good questions to be asking? All right, so at this point, you've gone through your administration questions, you've gone through some of your easier gameplay questions. So now it's time to get into the more taxing part of session 0s, where you actually start discussing with your players what kind of game you will be playing. Now, there's a long list of ways to do this. If you Google online, you're going to find tons of different articles, tons of write-ups on different session 0s, how you can do that, what can work. All of this advice I'm about to give you here are things that I've picked up over my years of DMing. This is not gospel. None of this is how you have to do it. These are just suggestions that I have found helpful for me as a DM. So, with that, let's start with some of the questions that you'll hear a lot of people telling you. What are the lines and veils of your table? So, for those of you who might not be super versed in RPGs, lines and veils is a series of sort of vocabulary with which to describe what can be allowed in a game and what cannot be allowed in a game. When you're asking your players what their lines and veils are, what you're doing is you're asking what are things you never ever want to see in the game, your hard lines, and what are things that could be encountered in the game but not focused on, your veils. An example I like to use for this one is, say, spiders. If spiders are a hard line, then you never put spider monsters in. Driders would be off limits. You usually wouldn't talk about cobwebs or anything like that, depending on your player and how they describe that. But if spiders is a veil instead, you might be able to mention that, oh, this place is filled with cobwebs. Or, you see that you hear skittering off in the corner. That sounds vaguely insectoid. The difference between lines and veils is going to be, is it even allowed in the world? So if it's a line, don't put it in the world at all. If it's a veil, it could be in the world, but it should never be what your party is primarily focused on or primarily encountering. Lines and veils are also something that is very, very loose. It's going to change person to person and table to table. So always check it before a game. And I would also recommend checking it in the middle of games sometimes. Not like in the middle of a session, but like after a few sessions, just recheck, hey, these are the current lines and veils. Everyone's still okay with that. Anyone want to add anything to it? We've actually had situations before where my table would add something to the veil list later on because it turned out to be important in the scheme of the game. Always leave room for additions on that. It will make your game table a lot safer and a lot happier to be around. A second question I like to ask at my tables, that's actually a very new addition for me, is what kind of genre are we playing? You might know already that you're playing Call of Cthulhu, which is generally a horror game. But what kind of horror are we playing? What genre of horror are we playing? Are we playing, the Camp Crystal Lake slasher? Or are we playing the midsummer psychological horror? Asking what kind of genre are we playing is a great thing that I have found to make sure that all of my players are on the same wavelength and on the same level of what is and isn't going to be encountered in game. Making sure that everyone knows the genre ahead of time can help both with making sure you have a cohesive gaming experience, but also can be really helpful for people creating characters. They know what to lean into in their character and what might not be acceptable. For example, if you're playing that heist action movie, maybe we have a couple more rogues. Maybe we don't. Maybe somebody wants to play a paladin that's gotten wrapped up in the wrong thing. It just gives players an ability to make that choice consciously, which I find really elevates gameplay in the long run. Other things I like to talk about in this stage are going to be things such as, do you have any negative experiences in previous games? I like to use this question to learn what players may or may not like at a table. For example, if I were to answer this question, it would be something along the lines of, yeah, I don't like using the words legendary resistance at a table. If you're going to use a legendary resistance of a monster, make sure that you just describe it happening in game instead of saying, oh, that has no effect. For me personally, I find that hearing the description in game makes it feel less like a gotcha moment and more like an actual cool gameplay thing, narrative thing that's happening. This could be different for other players. This is why I like to ask, hey, are there any things previous games have done that you didn't like? And this lets me then, as a DM, be able to tailor my personal game experience for those players that I have found. Other questions that fall along these lines are, what are things that you've done in previous games that you really, really liked? For example, I've had a player before ask to change subclass. And that was a moment that he really enjoyed and that the table really enjoyed. So it's something that I've always left open as a possibility in my games. If there's a reason for your character to change subclass, or if you just want to, we'll come up with a reason for it to happen, and then I'll let you change the subclass, usually after a tiny little narrative arc. I find that it can create some really memorable moments. I find that it can keep interest at the table, especially on players who might have been falling into very repeatable patterns in combat or out of combat. These are things that, of course, are not D&D specific. These are general to any role-playing system, and can even be things such as, oh yeah, when people describe things, I prefer if you describe them with sounds as well. I think that makes the immersion a lot better. Or, yeah, one of my previous DMs put on music in the background and I wasn't the biggest fan of that because it made it hard to hear them. So maybe no background music. This is a really great opportunity in any session 0 to get the opinions of your players so you can just start off on a good foot with, okay, I know that these things are liked. I know that these things are not liked. Let's write a little bit more in the direction of things that people appreciate. A session 0 is also a really good time to talk about what safety tools you're going to use. If you watched my DMing horror games videos, you'll know that I tend to use a X-card system and a safe word system. This is, during session 0s, is when I usually introduce those things. I say, hey, this is the safety duck. If you touch him, the game stops. And it's a really good time for all of your players to learn what's going to go on, how they can choose to stop a game if they need to. Other things I like to talk about here are, do my players have any suggestions for other safety tools? Actually, the safety duck is not something I came up with on my own. It's something one of my previous players asked about, and I was like, sounds like a great idea. Let's use it. Giving the session 0 as a time for your players to give feedback into a game is a really great thing to do. And this is also why I would suggest checking in after you've played for a while about, hey, is there anything that's going well? Is there anything that isn't going well? Is there anything that you guys want to add? Especially with safety systems, those things are going to be constantly changing and evolving to best serve your players and your table specifically. Never be afraid to make changes, especially if they are changes that are requested by your players. Another thing that I like to do during session 0s is talk a little bit about PCs. So player characters, PCs, are things that you don't necessarily need to do during a session 0, but I find that it's very helpful to talk about, hey, what kind of characters do you guys want to play? What kind of things do you guys want to do? This can help along with the genre question of what genre are we playing. Asking about PCs can generally give the party a chance to talk about it out of character and go, oh yeah, this was really looking interesting to me. Or I'd really like to focus on sort of this theme in a character. And giving them a chance to talk about it out of game can lead to interesting party dynamics. It can lead to people making parties that either all have the same goal already or have complementary characteristics or skills. You can also, depending on the skill level, depending on how much time you have, you could sit down and actually make a character sheet all the way through with your players. This is something that I do if it's a player's first time in a system. I find that that helps a lot, especially because a lot of rulebooks can get confusing on what numbers go where and how to calculate them. Or it could be something as easy as, hey, guys, these are stats that I've decided that you guys can use, or these are the stats that you guys are going to roll together to use. And it lets people figure out, oh, okay, cool, makes sense. Now we're all at least balanced to each other instead of not balanced to each other. One other question that I find very important to ask in session 0s are the question of, is player character versus player character conflict allowed? And I'm not talking necessarily about combat such as, oh, I rolled to hit or I dodge. I'm talking more along the lines of, if character A is doing something that character B doesn't like, is it okay for these two player characters to have disagreements in game? And the next question is, if the answer to that question is yes, we can have player character to player character conflict, what is the worst possible outcome that we as a table are going to allow? Are you as a table going to be okay with one of these player characters having to leave the party because of this conflict? Or are you going to go into any player character versus player character conflict with the assumption that both of these characters will make up at some point and will still be okay with working together to the party goal? No answer is incorrect. It is something that I really like to decide ahead of time, just so that we all know, okay, even if things get bad between player characters, out of game as players, we're all able to know, no, this is likely how this is going to end. We can have discussions about it player to player about what each of our characters will do to continue the storyline or resolve the conflict, even if that resolution is one of us is leaving the party and bringing in a new player character. This is also something that we can use for things such as character death. Is character death going to be allowed in this game? If so, is it permanent? Is it reversible? What consequences would character death have? Characters dying is not necessarily a bad thing, but I would recommend letting the player of that character have a say in, is that character actually dead? So I hope that's helped a little bit, hearing sort of how I run my session zeros, suggestions that I have. But before I end off this video, I do want to specify once again, everything I've talked about here is just how I personally do it. If you search up session zeros, you will find a ton of resources about other ways people do things. Please, please, please look around for yourself, figure out what works for you, what doesn't. I suggest looking at reasonings, why people ask things they do, examining if that reasoning makes sense to you, and then choosing to either add it into your session zeros or not add it into your session zeros. I will have a write-up on my sort of websites about things that I like to do, questions I like to ask, that you can choose to use if you want. If it doesn't resonate with you, don't use it. It's always a suggestion, never a requirement. So, good luck with your new games, with your session zeros, and with your next sessions. After all, we're going to do this once more with feeling.